And what we see the end-to-end review is doing is basically saying, okay, well, how do we sort of, I guess, rebalance the scales and make it in a commensurate manner, like increase what we need from regulated parties and maybe make life a bit easier and a bit nicer, if you like, for connecting customers.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello and welcome to the Road Night Taylor podcast. Today we've got a very special guest here, Ali MacMillan from Ofgem. So we are talking about connections reform and the end-to-end review and the regulator's view. So Ali, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hi, thanks Catherine. So I'm Ali MacMillan. I co-lead the connections team at Ofgem, more on the sort of policy side, I guess, than my kind of co-lead Neil, who's kind of more of the team lead. And I lead on the end-to-end review, which we'll come on to later.
Awesome, thank you for coming. And we've got Kyle Murchie from Road Night Taylor as well.
Hi everyone.
So I think to kind of perhaps jump into this, we're recording in December. We have, we've just sort of got through the kind of slew of consultations on connections reform. Yeah, well done, Kyle. And I think it's been a busy month, is probably an understatement. So, I mean, perhaps could you just give us a view, Ali, maybe zoom out a bit, of the whole process, the kind of connections reform process. Has it been a good process?
It's definitely been a fast process, and I think that's a view that's pervasive across industry and everybody you speak to. I mean, we can kind of go back a year to the Connections Action Plan that we published joint with government. I think it was last November. So there's been a lot of kind of pace of work that's been taking place since then, and that's been a mixture of sort of tactical initiatives that the ESO and the ENA are implementing at transmission and distribution. There's different actions that we put on regulated parties in the Connections Action Plan, and sort of stemming from that was this idea of a new reformed connections process. So sort of moving away from, okay, how can we get the most out of what was the old what we used to
first
call
come,
it,
first served
model, which had given us this enormous queue, which was completely oversubscribed and the wrong mix of technology, so inefficient for GB's future need. And so there's a need to kind of think, okay, what can we do with the current process, but also what should a new process look like? And that led us to the kind of code mods being raised. I think it was back in April, May sometime. I mean, all the dates sort of blur into one now.
Yeah. I think April sounds about right,
Yeah, and since then it's just been an incredible pace of work. You'll probably know better than me how many work group meetings there were on the CUSC mods.
Yes, I probably can't say exactly how many because I have forgotten, but yeah, we're up there in the 50 sort of marker of work group meetings. Yeah.
Right, and during that period as well, there was sort of a necessary pause on other
code mods,
because
which has had quite a knock-on impact here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's obviously a kind of queue or a tranche of other problems to solve that we shouldn't forget about. They need to be addressed once connections is done. But that just kind of gives you a sense of how much sort of resource was required to sort of tackle this problem. In that, that was a sort of strategic decision to pause the other code mods because we needed so much industry attention on connections reform. And so we sort of moved through the code process, and what we know as connections reform was originally conceived as first ready, first connected. So as opposed to this sort of first come first serve model, where depending on when you applied to your network operator, you would be put in a queue, and that queue's kind of grown and grown. And I know you've kind of gone into the history of other pods of what led us to that position, but we needed to think about, okay, that's not working. How do we define a process that creates a kind of better queue of viable projects? Because we know there's a lot of speculation, lots of stalled projects in there. So first ready, first connected, as it was originally conceived, was all about that. And then there was this whole debate around what readiness is. Do you use land rights planning, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then we got into the summer, and there was an election and a new government, and this new government arrived with sort of fresh energy and this kind of real drive and real commitment and to a mission, sort of the clean power mission, and noises started to be made around Clean Power 30, and we'd always sort of talked about connections reform in two horizons. So the first one was about first ready, first connected. The second horizon was about alignment with strategic planning or some sort of strategic alignment in future, which was sort of always envisaged to be the SEP. So at the point at which the SEP came in, then we think about how to align the connections process to that. CP30 created an opportunity to do that strategic alignment quicker.
Yeah.
So you're effectively sort of aligning to a pathway, government's pathway to Clean Power 30, which of course they commissioned NESO to advise on, and we're expecting to see government's plan published very soon. And we're talking today on the, what was it, the 10th?
It's the 10th December.
So a huge amount still to happen this year. So we're expecting to see that plan. And that led us to away from first ready, first connected to first ready and needed first connected. So firstly, you had to demonstrate that you were ready. That debate had kind of happened. And then you also had to demonstrate that you were needed. So does CP30 need your project? And that's kind of led us into this position we're in now. The way that's manifested itself, I guess, for industry is that, you know, there's code mods, there's these new products that we know as methodologies that are sort of provided for in the codes, and that's where sort of more of the nuts and bolts of how the process works will sit. There's also license changes that are needed, so that's something that obviously we as Ofgem lead on. There's government's work on CP30 and everything that's gone into that, and basically what that's meant for industry is, you know, parallel work streams, lots of consultations, you know, lots of input needed from effectively the same fairly small group of people. And I know that that's a sort of tension that's felt like within industry, and we are cognizant of that. And we've always said, you know, the process is only as good as the kind of input that it gets from a consultative sense. So, you know, it has to be meaningful, and industry have to be able to sort of feed in. And maybe in an ideal world, you'd say, okay, maybe another 3 months would have been nice.
Yeah, I guess to let those newer ideas bed in, because we've sort of, perhaps from a customer perspective, it's been a bit back-ended. You know, we've almost, you know, those things have gathered momentum, and then, you know, 5th of November, we had a kind of mass release of, you know, wow, well, this is what CP30 might look like, and this is what aligning to those pots might look like. And, you know, actually that's a month ago, you know, so I suppose we've both introduced the idea and consulted on it, and now, you know, potentially a sort of, you know, resubmitting in a very, very short window of time. Do you have any, you know, do you feel from a regulatory perspective that has problems? The challenges, I'd say, more than problems.
You know, we need to be satisfied that when the package of products come to us for decision, which we're expecting before the end of the year, that, you know, we can kind of back our decisions, whatever they might be, knowing that the consultation process was meaningful, and knowing that, you know, industry had a sort of fair crack at the whip in feeding in. And that's something, you know, we are acutely aware of, and we're doing kind of lots of our own work within Ofgem to almost mark NESO's homework, if you like, so to make sure that what NESO are hearing from industry, that effectively they're using to shape their products that come to us for decision, you know, that we also have complete visibility and oversight of what's in there, such that we can take as informed a view as possible ourselves.
Which is really interesting because, you know, if you think about the code mods themselves, CMP 434 and 435, and then the methodologies most recently, the, you know, Gate 2 criteria methodology and the project designation, you could argue that those have gone through the industry quite a few times now. They were discussed in quite a bit of detail through CMP 434. They were obviously consulted upon there as well. So there's been both industry feedback within working groups, and then obviously subsequently in other consultations before the most recent one that closed last week. I suppose the CNDMs maybe a little bit different there, because I think, kind of thinking back to even sitting in the working groups, the intention was always that effectively work kind of a bottom-up maybe approach where it was built on top of, or can help facilitate, the Gate 2 criteria and project designation fitting in, kind of pulling together what was in the code mods. Whereas now, I suppose that additional layer that's going to come in of CP30, it's doing a little bit of the bottom up, but it's also very much top down of how does it facilitate that CP30 layer, which Catherine, as you said, we only saw this really from an industry perspective and kind of everything in one go on the 5th of November. So to have been able to consult on that, well, assimilate the information, then discuss it, consult on it, and then feed back, was quite a fast pace. So yeah, just could you kind of hear your views on?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair that, you know, the CNDM is probably the area that's maybe had sort of least opportunity for kind of industry feedback to sort of shape what that end product will be. And I think we're expecting to see, you know, some more information over the coming days from NISA about basically some additional detail, like within CNDM and the process of how that works. And I think it's sort of incumbent on us as Ofgem to sort of make sure that, okay, are we satisfied that, you know, the bar has been met effectively, because these consultations, you know, they're not subject to a governance process like, you know, the code mods are or license changes are. So there's that sort of open question about, okay, what is meaningful consultation? If it was happening as part of a sort of a governance process that's enshrined, then at least you know that you followed due process. It's a bit more difficult to ascertain that when it comes to the methodology. So it's really important that we satisfy ourselves that, you know, the bar hasn't been reached where we might have to say, actually, we think a second consultation might be needed here.
Yeah, because it's that trade-off between, you could say, well, on one hand, there may be a lot of responses, a lot of good quality responses, a lot of significant information in some of those responses. But if it's only one iteration or responses on the first iteration and not responses on several iterations, I suppose that balance between volume and quality alongside the number of iterations that the industry has been able to have. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. But I guess we mustn't lose sight of, you know, we talked back to the original question about has this been a good process? I think it's been driven by a need to kind of sort this out very quickly. And it's the same argument that you can make for, you know, the SEP. When the SEP comes out, you know, let's not, and I know this was sort of in the press recently, but let's not take forever to produce the perfect SEP.
80-20 rule.
Yeah, exactly, and leave it so long that actually you don't leave enough time at the end to actually realise any benefit from it.
Yeah.
And clearly, you know, this is a very high impact, hopefully a very high impact set of reforms across the whole energy trilemma. And the sooner, we think anyway, the sooner we get a good first ready, first needed connections process in place, the sooner we can start seeing benefits on, you know, affordability, you know, net zero, which has clearly been the kind of big one throughout this process, and security of supply. And that's really what's driving the pace. So you've got to find the balance between, you know, running a good enough process such that it gets you to an answer and allows you to enjoy the benefits that we expect this to bring, as opposed to taking kind of longer to optimise and maybe kind of losing some of that benefit at the other end.
Yeah, and the sort of great being the enemy of the good, I suppose,
exactly.
You know, in that sense, and I suppose, which is a very, you know, I think that's a very pertinent point, and it's perhaps quite easy to kind of like sagely nod and say, yes, that seems like a really good kind of compromise, until suddenly it's sort of your project that's being thrown out of the queue, you know, perhaps because of sort of methodologies that you don't think are perfect. And so I suppose there is a kind of fundamental question here, which is perhaps one we hear from developers, but effectively, from the outside, this probably looks a little bit like we're basically saying, does this mean that the ESO now just get to decide who gets to connect where and when, and, you know, and is that fair? Is fair the right kind of benchmark that we should be using to determine whether this reform is successful? I don't know if you've got thoughts on fairness.
Yeah. So I mean, when we, you know, you hear the words sort of central planning used when we talk about needed. I think central planning evokes, you know, ideas of, you know, this very heavy hand coming from above, and, you know, making very specific acute decisions in different areas about who wins and who loses. I don't think central planning is maybe the right phrase to use to describe what needed really is. I mean, what needed is effectively NISO saying, okay, here's kind of government's plan for CP30 that we've advised them on. And let's sort of break it down to what it is. It's effectively, what we expect it to be, I should say. We expect it to be a sort of series of pots of technologies that can connect in different areas.
Yeah.
Now, obviously,
up to 2030.
Up to 2030. And then, what happens beyond 2030? There's still a kind of quite an active debate around that about kind of what you do with fares, what you do with SEP when that comes in, but we'll kind of leave that for another day. But effectively, that's what needed is, and so that means that NESO are, or will be, if all of this goes through, they'll be sort of assessing your application against, okay, do you broadly fit within, or do you fit within one of these quite broad pots, as set out in the government's plan. So it's not a case of NESO going in and really kind of getting down into the weeds and picking winners and losers. There's a very sort of clear set of parameters there that have been defined that ultimately you need to meet as a project. And ultimately, again, back to the point, why are we doing this? All of those kind of big benefits. Ultimately, if your project isn't needed, then is it fair that the system accommodates you on your project, your product onto the system? I mean, there's a debate around that, I'd say. So fairness works both ways.
Yeah, I suppose it being realistic as well. I guess this is all seen through that lens of the 80-20 kind of approach. So I suppose there's got to be a realistic acknowledgement within the industry that perhaps those needed criteria may not be perfect. Those pot allocations may not be spot on. And there are probably people sitting there thinking, well, at the moment, it does feel like I'm being sort of penalised by a decision that says we think 90% of that solar capacity should be at distribution, for example, or something. That might be people who are saying, well, actually, I think not my specific project, but my entire sector, has been sort of a decision has been made, maybe without a huge amount of kind of published justification for that decision. So I suppose that there's that kind of feeling where it's not just someone saying this specific project of mine. It's someone saying, well, actually, there's been what looks like a fairly arbitrary decision made as to how those technologies are split across transmission and distribution, which we've talked about lots at Road Taylor, but also across a few sort of geographic zonal boundaries. Is that kind of a concern Ofgem are hearing too?
Yeah, I mean I guess the sort of numbers, it's worth saying that are in those pots have effectively kind of come bottom up. We expect them to have come bottom up from the DNOs around, this is what's sort of broadly in our queue, and similarly from the NESO at transmission. So you're sort of taking, what's coming down the conveyor belt anyway, and you're doing a bit of optimization to say, well, actually, we've got 10 times too much battery storage. We've got too much solar that's inefficient for the system in certain areas. So there's a degree of optimization, as I understand it, that's sort of taken place to kind of get to that final number, but I mean, I wouldn't say it's arbitrary. I think it's very well informed, and I guess at the back end of this, only time will tell as to, the winners that are created and the losers that are created, because there will be some losers.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if you're a loser because the system really just does not need your project, I agree that's different from if you're a loser because the process has been unfair. And these numbers that underpin this process are arbitrary. And again, it's incumbent on us to, I guess, do what we can to make sure that's not the case.
Yeah, they're not arbitrary numbers.
Yeah.
Kyle, I saw your face, so do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just when you said kind of well-informed, because I think this may be that nuance of, from where we started and from getting a starting point and creating some sort of numbers, well, you could argue, yes, they've taken, a certain level of information, the best information available within a very short period of time to create those pots. Noting that the information that's currently out there is obviously indicative, it's in draft format and not version 0.2. So it's intended that those will change, but I think from what we see, even just adding up some of the numbers, even speaking to not only developers but also some of the networks, there's definitely a lot of holes in those numbers, but also I think you mentioned the batteries. I think that's maybe a clearer case. You could argue that comparing to the feds, for example, well, if you're looking nationally, there's significant oversubscription, but when you then start looking at, Catherine, as you were saying there, between maybe two different zones. Now I know that NESO's intention is that there would be substitution between zones and that ability would be there. But I think as a developer sitting there, you're saying, well, hold on, I'm a transmission connected solar, for example. But actually, if I was now just I was the same project but now connected to distribution level, then I would be available to effectively move forward in theory. See, when we've been looking at when we start to kind of layer on the network aspects and the kind of limitations at maybe SGT level, and thinking about also even just some other basic concepts around what can you realistically get planning for in those sorts of areas. It's not clear how much of that's yet been taken into those numbers. It's not saying that wouldn't come in the future, but at the moment, I think from those numbers that have been presented, I think the danger is there's unintended consequences and also pushing forward certain behaviours in the market that maybe were slightly unintended. I know it's a challenge because you've got quite a limited time frame. But I don't know if is that something you've been hearing about as well in terms of data quality and I suppose concerns about how those pots are set now, but also how they'll change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it absolutely is a challenge for NESO, is to make sure that those numbers are sort of fair, and like you say, there are protections or there's flexibilities in place, like substitutability across zones, or maybe even substitutability between transmission and distribution, if indeed the numbers are kind of different. So you have a distribution specific number and a transmission specific number in a particular zone. If that's the case, then again, back to the point before, it's absolutely incumbent on NESO to make sure that, fairness, it sort of underpins the process, and you're not, I guess, there aren't unintended consequences that negatively impact a project for something as arbitrary as the wrong number in the wrong place, for example. So yeah, I completely agree, particularly because the process has been moving so fast and how information has flowed out, that there probably are developers out there that are concerned about this, and we have to make sure that investor confidence is taken into account and protected as far as possible throughout all of this. That's critically important. But yeah, I could appreciate that some developers may have some of those concerns, and we'll just have to see kind of how they manifest going forward.
And Catherine, something we were chatting about earlier actually was when you were talking about investor confidence and developer concerns. We are seeing quite a lot of developers that are concerned, but only concerned because they're just hearing about or just starting to better understand what CP30, that kind of CP30 layer is like. They are effectively back to what TMO4 Plus was initially conceived as. I suppose if you think back to the summer, Chris Stark and Mission Control was only set up on the 9th of July, and all of a sudden we're now here talking about quite a detailed and complicated layer. So I'm just thinking that are we in a situation where there is quite a big gap? You've got a lot of very informed developers and the informed part of the community who are actively engaged, who have been actively engaging through working groups. You've then probably got others that are aware but less actively involved themselves, but they understand there's some level of risk and maybe opportunity. And then probably a very significant proportion that don't actually have visibility. They don't know that their project that they're currently working on, currently investing in, potentially might not be a viable project in 6 months' time.
Yeah, and the information flow out of this process is the same as, I guess, you sort of see with any public consultation process, that the most invested in or the most engaged are always clearly the ones that are going to kind of be most aware and be across the detail to the greatest extent. And mustn't forget about the silent majority who, and I'm sure there are developers out there that don't even know connections reform is at all a thing, because effectively why would they? And that's something we've always been we've tried to protect against by so we publish a blog every month from Connections following the monthly delivery board, really with the intent to kind of update people in lay terms about kind of what's being discussed, what the outcome of recent discussions were, what's coming next. There's obviously a very active debate, as I understand it, although I'm not on LinkedIn, but I understand there's quite a lot of active debate on LinkedIn. But I guess really we're sort of relying on word of mouth, and we're relying on, I guess, the likes of yourselves to just kind of get that word out there to the developer community that this is happening, because it's true that there are the corners of the developer community that are going to be very difficult to reach.
And I suppose that comes back really just to your point about meaningful consultation. In some ways it's sort of a best efforts, isn't it? We can only do what we can do as an industry, but then it's perhaps part of that review to say, are there any really big gaps of people who didn't respond to this? Is there an equal representation of things like transmission versus distribution? We've talked lots on other podcasts about kind of fairness between T&D customers and things like queue positions and so on. And I suppose, there has been a bit of a general comment that perhaps sometimes the focus of connections reform feels very transmission-y, partly because it's being done by NESO, who sort of feels like a transmission system operator still. And so, is there a kind of fundamental concern about underrepresentation of distribution customers? But I mean, in some ways, that probably brings us on to the kind of other part that we wanted to talk about today, which is the kind of end-to-end review and looking more at that kind of journey.
Yeah.
I mean, was there anything you wanted to add on that kind of transmission versus distribution sort of representation piece?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it probably is worth saying that, connections reform through the CUSC mods is largely a transmission process. And
just knowing what a CUSC mod is, you're very unlikely to do that if you're a 5 megawatt distribution customer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and distribution are sort of naturally, I think it's fair to say, the policy takers of connections reform, and you're putting in a new process at transmission, and then you're effectively saying to DNOs through the ENA, right now you need to come up with your own process to plug into this. Effectively, we'll give you some pots, and you have to then figure out how to fill them, and then send those projects back to us through, I guess, what would have been the old project progression route, but I think it's now called
the
transmission
TEA.
Evaluation assessment, something like that, the TA process.
T.
The T process. The T process.
A cup of tea and decide if you're in or out.
And that's very much like where the DNO's distribution is now. So they're sort of frantically working to make sure that they can create a process that when, again, if this is all approved early next year, when we expect to take decisions, and we then go to that gate to whole queue process, because I guess something we haven't talked about is that this is a retrospective action.
Yeah.
This is the reopening of connection agreements. And
We have talked about that lots of other podcasts.
I know you have in other pods, we haven't touched on it today. But you're effectively taking the 740 gig, I think it is now, across transmission distribution, opening everything up and then reordering it. That's what gate 2 to whole queue is. So and then you've got the new process that deals with new applications in the future. And the detail tells us how that works at transmission, but there is still this question of how the DNOs are going to reorder their queue. And I know you had a very active, spirited debate on that recently, but distribution really kind of figuring those things out now. Yeah,
because actually if you're a distribution connected customer, and even if you're relatively well informed, the last communication you may have seen would have been the RFI to gain some understanding of whether you'd be Gate 2 ready for implementation. So in your head, you understand you maybe have gone and reviewed documents at that particular point in time before responding to that, but there wouldn't really been a natural trigger to then say, I'm going to now start relooking to see what else has come along. So the CP30 layer probably wouldn't have even registered in most of those, for most of those developers, unless they are involved at both T&D or very heavily involved in the industry developments. Yeah. Because even at DNO events, I think one of the challenges, DNOs have mentioned absolutely and communicated on CP30 and connections reform, but the layer of detail hasn't been there. And one of the arguments given is, it's still developing at transmission level, so they need to understand what that looks like to then be able to really pick it up and say, right, now let's build a process that fits into that. Yeah. But all that means, surely, is that we're going to be well into next year before that process for those customers is understood. But we're probably already implementing, if it's all implemented from kind of Q2 2025, it feels like a very, very short space of time for embedded customers compared to those at transmission.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttaylor.co.uk so you don't miss out on any of the podcast webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explainers.
And I mean, I guess we that podcast, which we'll pop a link into, looks at sort of one specific issue on the transmission distribution, kind of sort of how these relative queue positions work out. It was all sort of spurred by some comments we had back on a webinar that we'd done on connections reform. Things that Road Knight Taylor have lots of distribution connecting customers. And sort of people who share portfolios across the two. And there does always seem to be quite, I think there is a very strong feeling sometimes that distribution customers have sort of, been done down, or there's a lot of kind of hurt there about sort of past inequalities. And so we were really excited to have you on, Ali, to talk about the end-to-end review process, because I think it's going to be really welcomed by so many customers as an opportunity to sort of listen to some of that pain, where were the pain points, learn from it, and potentially implement some pretty sort of hard-hitting policies to stop some of those sort of unintended practices which have gone on. So do you want to just do a quick intro as to what the end-to-end review is and the consultation that's open now?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another action that stems back to the Connections Action Plan. So, back in November 2023, this was an action we put on ourselves as the regulator to say, okay, we have a regulatory framework that underpins a connections process. Let's take the opportunity to open up all aspects of the regulatory framework and understand where it might need strengthened or improved or even softened, if that's the right answer, in some cases, to drive the right behaviours and outcomes we need to see in the new process. So we've always, internally within Ofgem anyway, we've always talked about there being kind of two pathways to the sort of new utopian connections process, one of which is you deal with the process itself, so the mechanics of that, and that's what connections reform is. But the other pathway, if you like, is to say, okay, within that process, what do we need to do with the regulations to make sure that we're basically getting the best outcomes for developing customers in a manner that's fair to regulated parties in the new process. So that's what the end-to-end review is. We call it the end-to-end review because it's basically looking at the customer journey from the original conception in someone's head of the idea of a connection right through to energisation. And there are a number of interactions along the journey that the customer sort of must necessarily take with the regulated party. And there's a number of actions that the regulated party must take to get that idea through to energisation. So it's looking at the whole journey and saying which bits are working, which are not, and what should we do about them.
And I think it's so welcome in some ways because it does cover that whole journey, because we often, when we talk about connections, we are often really very focused on the front end of connections to the point where you get and sign a connection offer or a connection agreement. And actually, the end-to-end review proposes things like, or looks at things like, should there be more sort of stringent targets or requirements and obligations on the TO to meet really, or network operator to meet really specific connection deadlines. So if they give you an offer that says you're going to connect you in October 2027, should there be a penalty for them if they don't? Which I think a lot of people it will really resonate with. Because the value of that piece of paper that you get. It's got a really well-regulated process that says you must issue the connection offer within 90 days. But then actually, what happens after that point, once the customer's accepted? There's amazingly little regulation, really, is there? For so a TO could be multiple years late, a DNO could not submit a project progression, and actually there are no regulatory actions for people to take. So that was one point of that end-to-end review that really sort of stood out for me. Actually, the kind of making it equitable, so that if we're placing obligations like milestones on the customer connecting, we are also placing significant obligations on the network operator or the licensed party to kind of to meet those.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it is, it's a sort of a rebalancing of the scales, if you like. So we expect the connections reform, we expect the new process to basically make life a bit easier for regulated parties, but effectively make life harder for developers, because you've now got to do more to get into the queue, and you've now got to do more to stay in the queue.
You've raised that bar,
Yeah, and what we see the end-to-end review is doing is basically saying, okay, well, how do we rebalance the scales and make it in a commensurate manner, like increase what we need from regulated parties and maybe make life a bit easier and a bit nicer, if you like, for connecting customers like throughout the process. So, driving up standards of service, more stringent requirements at different parts of the process on timeliness, and basically trying to get to a point at which we've got a sort of fair set of connections regulations that mean that the regulated party is absolutely held to account for standards of service provided to the customer and effectively the timeliness of their connection.
And there are sort of 3 points that kind of almost as a pincer movement try and sort of lock that down, that what that good service looks like, because there's both suggesting that there might be need to be a kind of obligation or a penalty for late delivery on the part of a network operator, but combined with that, because obviously if we told everyone that the network operators were going to have huge liquidated damages if they were even a day late, they might just write us all connection offers which says you can connect in 2040. So you've kind of combined with that. Your other kind of 2 points. You've asked for sort of ambition in sort of accelerating connections, and also I liked seeing that kind of quality of actually sort of quality assurance, because I think we can all say that over the last few years we've all seen a kind of a degradation in the level of either kind of thought or quality that's been able to go into connection offers. So I think that those kind of 3, was that kind of deliberate to sort of try and say, well, we want to incentivise those right behaviours. So when we're saying, deliver on time, we don't mean, just give people a really long connection date.
Yeah. So when we were thinking about kind of how to sort of split up all of the issues that we're aware of, because just I guess going back to basics before I come on to that point, what this effectively is, it's an airing of all of the substantive issues that we're aware of that connecting customers face throughout the process, and not just connecting customers, but also there's some bits and pieces in there that have come directly from the DNOs or the TOs or NISA, where they've said, well, this bit isn't quite right. So it's effectively an airing of all the issues, and then thinking about how to group them efficiently and sensibly, and then how to sort of target action to drive improvements against the different groups of issues. So we've come up with 7 themes, and you've just described, I think it was themes 3, 4 and 5. So it became quite clear that, and this won't be news to you, there's a lot of frustration, as you already said, about the ability at times for a network company to sort of unilaterally shift your date back, and you effectively have no comeback as the customer. You've just got to suck it up and take it. Well, that's something that clearly we're going to try and address through this process. And the obvious thing to do there is to hold the network company to greater account against the connection date, such that can't happen anymore. And it has to be done in a fair manner, because clearly there are circumstances occasionally out with the network company's control that might push a date back. But if you are going to hold them to greater account, then you need to make sure they retain that ambition. And there is some wording in the regulatory framework now around, I think it's something like time being of the essence or something it says in the licence. So what the consultation is testing is that enough? We don't want to be in a situation where everybody gets really kind of long connection dates because, like you say, networks are held to a greater account, potentially through liquidated damages against those dates. And then you come on to the quality point. And there has been a lot of focus to date in the regulatory framework about the timeliness within which certain processes have to happen. And I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cases, that's not really benefiting anyone, like the customer or the
I've had conversations where, you might have been talking to a network operator that said, actually this is really complicated, and you might have a customer that says, I'm happy to sort of pause the clock, for you to go away and think about this some more. And and a regulatory person will, from that network operator will say, I'm sorry, we can't really do that. There isn't a stop button. We have to carry on, and you'll have to mod app later down the line or something. Like you say, it's just inefficient.
Exactly, and the behaviours that drive, because that's something we've always got to think about. So we write these regulations, but ultimately, what behaviours is it driving, like within the regulated party? And what they're doing is they're effectively having to sort of scramble resource into meeting these timeliness requirements, which sort of impacts on other areas of their business. So
and anything that sits outside a timeliness requirement might take a year to do because they can't prioritise it.
So they go to they focus on the timeliness, and then ultimately on the 59th day of a 60-day requirement, or whatever it might be, the offer goes out, but the regulated party would rather have had more time to make that better. And the customer would clearly have liked them to have taken longer to make that better. And when we talk about quality, we mean what underpins the offer, the level of analysis and detail that sort of has gone into the offer, as well as the product that they're presented with. So how understandable is it? How clear and transparent is it for the customer? That's what we mean when we talk about quality. So yes, there's a package there of quality, timeliness and ambition, and we need to sort of strike the balance there. And so very interesting to see what we get back.
I have a question about cost, because that's something we haven't talked about yet in terms of the end-to-end review. We're always at Road Knight Taylor championing the SGT charging issue, supergrid transformer charging. We've wrote an open letter a while ago, and have sort of had some industry discussions, but this isn't somewhere which has made very much progress, against things like connections reform. Is it something which is going to be covered by the end-to-end review?
No, and I hope I remembered to call out in the review that we deliberately weren't covering it, and I can't remember if I did or not. That was certainly my intention.
if not, you might get lots of responses talking about it.
Hopefully everybody listens to this podcast and then knows not to respond on that point. At SGT reinforcement cost apportionment is clearly a very live issue. It's something that, again, we called out in the Connections Action Plan, and Road Knight Taylor had very helpfully written an open letter. I think it was maybe in the middle of last year.
Yeah, it's about 18 months ago, I think.
Setting out the sort of issues and the acute problems that it was creating for developers and the knock-on impacts. It's a difficult area to solve because that it does require sort of policy direction and steer from other areas like wider charging reform, REMA, etc. So there has been I think a good amount of discussion this year, Ofgem, ENA, industry, TOs, etc., about what to do about this, and it does seem to only be able to go so far before it has to sort of stop and say, okay, we need to wait for X, Y, and Z to happen to inform it. So regrettably, I think there has been less progress possible on that specific point, but it's
okay. So although it may be a pain point for people on their customer journey from sort of end to end, this one isn't the mechanism to feed it back.
No, but I would say, look, this is a mechanism. So if you have views on it, then please actually do use this forum to air them, because I guess from the regulator's perspective, we consult on things and we ask questions. Sometimes we get sort of unsolicited responses about other things, but that's useful. It can be very useful. It can not be useful, but it can be very useful. So look, if there are views out there that you don't feel, as a stakeholder have been or you've seen them reflected in progress on SGT reinforcement cost apportionment, then do use this mechanism to feed that back.
And I mean, the tranches are wide enough that they do seem to kind of allow quite a lot of coverage. For example, even just on costs, if it was more general on cost increases that are being seen within offers and that quality aspect, quality seems to be quite an easy area to put some of those kind of key points into.
Yeah, that's fair.
But I think it's good to actually call out that, because for a lot of our listeners and a lot of people that we've been talking to, I think the general expectation was that, this is another consultation on connections reform. But actually, it's really not. So it's on the whole connections process. And sure, there's reform aspects that I think will definitely flow in. One that I know we're going to touch on is data and data quality, data visibility, data transparency. Also, that was really important before. In today's world, it's extremely important, and we need to be raising that bar. But as soon as we start to bring in everything we've just talked about this year and all the reforms, that bar just goes through the roof, in terms of where we actually need to get to, and the roadmap, what's it going to look in 2025 and then beyond, because realistically that visibility can't be all there within 2025, but we need to, as a community, all understand where that's going to. So are you looking for, in that response to the data tranche, are you looking for responses really thinking about that longer term approach? What would you like to get out of that?
Yeah, so I mean, data visibility, accuracy, openness, however you want to call it. I mean, it's such a massive area. So I think this is theme 1, if I remember rightly.
Yes, I like the fact it came out as number 1. Right. I thought, that's good, because it's the first thing I was going to write back on as well.
And it's obviously there has been a lot of work done, whether it's through regulation, so say through the price controls, because there've been certain requirements for data publication that have fed through the price controls, or be it something that sat in regulation sort of prior, or be it something that DNOs or TOs, NISA have done off their own backs. But it felt like it absolutely is the right place to pull all of that together and say, okay, there's so much data that exists. Some, regulated parties are publishing it, some aren't. Some have kind of created these really nice new interfaces where the data can be more easily absorbed and used. And ultimately what we're trying to do here when we talk about data availability, this is really about informing and educating the developer community and kind of better or driving up quality of connection offers and managing customer expectations. And when you speak to network companies, they will say, oh no, this would be really good for us, because that means the better informed the customer is, the more ability they have to absorb information about where there might be capacity on the network, or what might sit in front of me in the queue, what costs might I be exposed to if I try and connect over here. All of that better informs the customer and means that they need less support and hand-holding through the process, and they basically enter the process with a more educated set of expectations. So this really
brilliant
is
theory.
a brilliant theory, but this feels to me like a win-win. Like, we get the data bit right and everybody wins. And the question is, how do we do that? Like, what are the blockers? What is it that's preventing this piece of data that would be incredibly useful to that developer? What's preventing it being published, and how can we unblock that?
And I think that's really important, actually, that we do give, as an industry, we give you guys, the regulators, some clear feedback, because I think we've probably, lots of listeners will have sat in conversations where they've said things like, why can't I have a list of demand customers, a demand register, for example? That's been requested from NISO, quite significantly in the last sort of 6 months or so. There's been similar questions at distribution level about, the ECR covers generation, doesn't cover demand. And a lot of the time I think there is a perception within network operators that their hands are bound by contract clauses or confidentiality, or, and so therefore there are barriers to them releasing this.
Yeah.
Or, I think NISA have recently said that they think it will take them 12 to 18 months to produce a demand register, and we probably think, why isn't it a spreadsheet that we could do in a couple of weeks? So I think almost that bringing that challenge of saying, well, actually, right now you've got people who are saying, I need to know about demand connections as well as generation. I need to, if you're going to divide up the country into these kind of zones, I need to be able to have a map of those zones. I need to, if you're going to publish some bar charts, I want to know what the actual numbers are behind the bar charts. Yeah. So you might get some good shopping lists, back of people saying, actually, this is the data I need right now, and here are some excuses I've been given about, why it was hard, why, and we need you to kind of unpick that.
Yeah, and look, that's certainly the approach I want to take to this. So I basically want to hear everything that a developer needs to see, and I want to understand, we want to understand why is that not currently the case, and then we need to think about, okay, what do we need to do to unblock that? Because, and it's, this isn't just a connections issue. As every industry has effectively digitized, there's enormous amounts of data being produced everywhere, and there are lots of sort of reasons, some good, some bad, as to why data just isn't reaching the end user in a way that's useful and usable. And it can seem a bit mystifying, I think, when you think about connections as sort of very sort of high-tech digital industry, if you like. Why are we still lagging behind on data availability and visibility? It doesn't make sense. So I think this is the absolute place to invite everybody to tell us what they want to see, and then we can figure out how we can solve that. And I should say that I don't want this to sort of seem like an attack on regulated parties, because they are doing a lot of good work in certain areas with data, and I think we need to call that out. So the single digital view, for example, they've all developed tools this year which allow customers, they're basically sort of visualization platforms to allow customers to see some of this data. There's a very specific proposal in the document which is around a kind of ongoing regulatory requirement to continuously maintain and improve those tools. But there's also the question of, should we really be targeting our attention on the networks producing their tools, or should we be more thinking about, let's just get the networks to make the data available in a usable format such that the market can then pick that data up, and then through market dynamics you end up with a sort of very a really, really great set of tools that
Yeah.
ultimately networks won't be able to produce themselves.
Yeah.
So where should the focus be?
Which
Yeah.
is perhaps the way the DNOs have gone. In some ways, there's some really good stuff on sort of like the DSA open, the data platforms, open data portals. A brilliant sort of provision of publicly accessible data in kind of raw data formats that then there've been great sort of third-party tool developments on.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to ICE. That the kind of ICE program really did help drive some of that forward with the ECR coming out, and that really made that
I was
happen.
thinking ICE. You have to remind us what that was, but you mean competition and connections?
Yes.
Yeah.
But actually, I
ICPs.
suppose the unintended consequence of making that change. So again, thinking about between price controls and those incentives changing, was that you ended up with those actual teams that were developing those in DNOs then end up changing. So although we've driven new outputs through likes of open data, and then as you said, those kind of visualization tools more recently, it does. Yeah, it's just thinking about that kind of knock-on impact, what we've seen in the past, and I suppose kind of learning from that too. But when you're talking about just that general open data and being able to utilise that, I think something that's going to come up actually at quite a few industry working groups more recently is the idea of being able to not just collect data from the DNOs, because the DNOs, or the networks in general, are obviously collecting that information from customers. So having an easy ability for whether it's industry bodies or developers directly to say, well, that data, that's my data, and that's wrong. You've got the wrong connection date in there, or you've got the wrong, we've novated, but you haven't updated that information. How can they go in and ultimately make that change more easily? I'm not necessarily saying like, Wikipedia where people can just start writing it. You could have the data quality there. Just delete these. Oh, I don't like these. These are my competitors. Let's just delete their lines. Not getting that level of flexibility, but how can those be more central, kind of single source of truth, and then also the ability to, to more easily update your own data.
Yeah.
So
which I
what
don't think
really
is-
we need,
yeah.
the single digital view needs to be renamed as Connectopedia.
Connectopedia.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
There we go.
Now I'm conscious we have chatted for ages about all of this good stuff. Ali, presumably there's a deadline for people to respond to the end-to-end review.
Yeah. Look, I mean, hands up, this hasn't come out at the best time for industry.
I'll be doing it on Christmas Eve. Don't worry.
Right, good. I'm glad to hear that. But 13th of January is the deadline that we put for responses. We're very cognizant of the pressures on industry. I would expect it to be, again, the same people that are largely feeding into this process that we expect to be feeding into the various consultations on connections reform. Do just reach out. If anyone's struggling with that deadline, this is a process that is absolutely only as good as the information that comes back in response to it. So that's the focus.
So don't let that 13th of January deadline put people off responding if they need an extra.
If they need longer, just reach out and maybe if kind of few people kind of give that view, we could then think about, okay, let's just push this out a bit and.
July or something like that.
Yeah. Well, no, we want these reforms to the regulatory framework in as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
So
Again,
that's
moving at pace.
Absolutely, moving at pace. So clearly, that again, there's that trade-off. But I'm not going to lie. The start of next year looks pretty busy for me as well.
Yeah.
Away from the end-to-end review, just of everything else connections. So I'm not sure we'd be able to do a lot with it and make a lot of progress. So, if it was into February, I don't think that's a disaster.
Well, we'll be sure to post some reminders as well, I think, on LinkedIn,
Absolutely.
just to flag this one because, it does seem like a great opportunity for developers to get some real benefits that they've been asking for. So
and hopefully, again, it comes across in the consultation that nothing's really off the table. If there's anything that you want to air that doesn't fit into any of those themes, don't let that stop you. Let's just get all the issues out in the open. And
I've already made a mental note. We'll still include SGT charges just to keep it.
Yeah,
I fully
You've heard
expect
that.
Fantastic. Right. Well, thank you so much, Ali, for coming in
pleasure.
and making it to Burford. Absolutely. Great to hear all of that progress. And thank you really for spearheading the end-to-end review because, as we say, seriously welcome it as a bit more of a rebalancing.
Great. Glad to hear it.
And thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttailor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Knight Tailor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttailor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you.